going to talk a little bit about today is sort of, it's going to be a bit of a think piece. Have you thinking about what does it actually mean to play? Because I think in this industry we talk a lot about gaming and play as being synonymous. And the reality is they're not. They're actually different types. Gaming is a form of play. So I want to talk a little bit about what is play. What does it mean across age groups? Now, this is what my firm specializes in. We actually focus on developing play. We work with a lot of gaming companies. We work with toy companies. We work with playgrounds. But I want us to think, because as casual game creators, in some respects, it's more important for us to be digging into what play is, because play is sort of the basis of casual gaming, right? There's a lot of boundaries that have been broken in this idea of what gaming is by the casual gaming industry, right? So that's why I want to focus a little bit on this today. So at Play Science, we bring together the heart of the creator, the mind of the researcher, and the soul of the consumer. So we're kind of academic geeks who spend a lot of time with industry geeks. And we try to bring this idea that if you inherently understand what your consumer is going through, in this case with regard to play, that it's going to help you to create games or products that are going to be intuitive, that are going to be exciting, that are not going to be really hard to market because they're going to be super viral, right? And if you look at the examples of the casual games or whatever that have really taken off, and not just casual games, virtual worlds or any other type of platform game that you see, they tend to follow along really core play patterns that people across ages have. So let's start off just with a little bit of video, keep you guys awake this morning. This is from a global study we've been working on play, trying to figure out what are those core play patterns that we're seeing. Now this study in particular was focused on kids, so just keep that in mind. But what we've seen in our research is that a lot of these play patterns transcribe to adults. Obviously they look different, but they transcribe pretty well across the ages. I'm not going to show you that video, but if anyone wants to see it later on, you can ask me for it. All right. We'll keep moving. Okay, and you don't need to know more about us. Basically, we take a 360 approach to play. So I want to start by talking about why do we prioritize play? So thinking about why play is important. So first of all, play lights up our brain. If you look at the neuroscience research on play, you'll see it actually lights up different parts of our brain than any other thing that we do, right? It's highly engaging. And it's a very primal response, right? So as opposed to some of the sort of higher order thinking skills, when we're at play, if any of you are familiar with Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi's idea of flow, concept of flow, right? That's a core idea behind where we are when we're playing. When we're playing, we're in flow. We're not necessarily thinking about other things. It's highly addictive. I didn't say that if we're talking about kids, but it's really, it's important to keep in mind. Play fosters creativity. This is something I'll talk about in just a second, but I mean, certainly globally, we're facing a creativity crisis, right, with our kids, in that we're dealing, and not just our kids, our adults as well, in that we're dealing with a situation where we have so much structure and rigor around our education institutions and everything that we're losing a lot of the creativity that tends to foster really great ideas, right? But play helps us foster creativity. It's exploring what I can be, and for sort of younger generations, this is particularly important. This is how I figure out what I like to do, what I want to be, how I'm going to interact with people. And that's actually something that we see having a little bit of a different form depending on what culture you come from, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Play is attunement to others, right? So when you think about it, I mean, there's a reason when your company takes you on an offsite, they make you do those ridiculous games, right? Like, oh, fall back and see if your friend's going to catch you. And that's because when we play, it helps us to understand how we're going to interact with one another, right? And it helps us define those social rules around communication. Play also teaches rules, right? And I'll talk about this in a second. Sort of play teaches rules. It's also about breaking rules. It's safe failure, and that's really key when we start to talk about play in the context of education. And when I say education, I don't mean schools. I mean just sort of learning in general. The idea that, you know what, I can do things over and over and over again, and it's okay if I fail. It's part of the reason why people, when they get home from work, like to play games, right? I can totally fail at Angry Birds 1,000 times. No one is going to get on my case about it, right? So play is safe failure. And most importantly, play is learning by doing, right? Whatever this happens to be. I don't know if you guys have seen the most recent research on the transference of the actual kinetic or physical abilities for example, console gameplay, right? To things like medical students. And learning, and we've seen research that shows that if you prime medical students who are going to be doctors and they do a lot of gameplay, they actually are priming their physicalness so that they're better surgeons, right? So there's some interesting things about being able to not just learn cognitively, but learn physically what skills we can use. And I want to talk a little bit about the future and the kinds of things that we're needing to focus on. So we call these things 21st century skills, right? So things like critical thinking and problem solving, creativity, innovation, communication, collaboration, conflict resolution, information, media, and literacy. These are for the next upcoming generations of kids and adults. These are the most critical skills, and these are often the ones that are being missed in a lot of the formal education systems that we're seeing across the board. But in reality, these are the most important things, right? I mean, you guys, obviously, you work in the gaming industry or you work in technology, and you realize that it's something, I forgot the exact statistic, I think it's 75% of the jobs that kids a decade from now, or this generation, right, will have, don't exist today, right? When you think, I mean, think about how the industry has changed thus far, not just this industry, but every industry. So the idea is we're needing to be teaching people across the board to learn. We have a massive issue, not just with kids, but with older generations who were not used to necessarily changing their skill set so quickly, and who are now sort of stuck, right? So we have these kinds of critical thinking, and learning obviously can occur at any age. So we really need to be thinking about how play can impact these 21st century skills. Another key thing is that we need to understand is that play is universal. There are a lot of different countries represented here today, and we know that the play patterns that we see are universal. That said, there is also something to be said for the local nature of play. So we call this sort of the globalized nature of play. So the things that are global, that's the things in the sort of the middle. Play as development, which is what I've been talking about. The idea of pretend play, that's a global type of play that we see. Role-playing, play as discovery, different types of object use, right? Those are all the global parts of play. Now, the local parts of play, though, there's actually a lot of difference that we've seen in doing research with different cultures. So things like the locus of play, meaning who actually sort of starts play, right? We see this in particular when you look at multiple people like parents and kids, or play instigation, things like, is it the child who starts play, or is it the parent that starts play? Certainly play themes differ by culture. Parental co-play, how much parents are actually part of the play. And also, when I was talking about locus of play earlier, this idea that why is play important, right? If you're in, let's take the US as a highly individualized country. In the US, the assumption is that play is important because it helps you become you, right? It helps you learn to be you. In other countries where there's less of an individualized focus and maybe there's more of a communal focus, we see that play is assumed to help you more with that attunement to others. It's more about learning to be a social being. So that's an interesting thing when you start to think about, okay, how do I develop, I'm going to call it casual play for now as opposed to calling it casual gaming. How do I develop casual play that can be global, right? How do I develop play that works sort of within these global things, but also takes into account that there are going to be different ways or different assumptions that people bring to sort of the play table, so to speak, right? So now let me talk a little bit about what play is and why play is not necessarily gaming. So first of all, play is neither inherently good nor bad, right? And obviously in the gaming world, we know this, right? You can play for good and you can play for evil, and that's not a bad thing, and in fact, it's good to do both to a certain extent. Play promotes social cohesion. It has rules, but it can also handle disorder, and this is a really key piece that sometimes differentiates play from sort of general gaming, is that the whole point of play is that you have, there are rules, either you're creating the rules or somebody else is, But you know what? Breaking the rules is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, breaking the rules can make it even more fun. I don't know if any of you guys ever do a lot of work with kids, but you know, if you're a kid, part of the fun is totally screwing up whatever the game is, right? You know, oh yeah, that's how you're supposed to play. Whatever. I mean, we played Monopoly as kids. We were not playing by the rules. I'm not saying I was cheating. I was bending the rules to my advantage, right? It has no material consequences. Again, you know, we were talking about earlier about safe failure, the idea that play gives us a space where, you know, if we fail or if we don't do well, that's okay. There's nothing negative necessarily that's going to happen to us, and it's voluntary. Now, that may seem sort of obvious, but this has been a big issue when people have been trying to talk about gamifying education, right? If you're forcing people to game, right, you're sort of taking the play element out of it. So it may still be a game, but is it really play? And I'm going to talk about motivation in just a minute. So if we look at sort of, there's a broad structure of play. You have the highly, highly structured play. This is like soccer games and sports matches where somebody extrinsically or externally, excuse me, is bringing the structure of the rules onto the gaming. Then you have, on the far other end, completely unstructured play, right? This is the sandbox. This is the, you know, kids just sort of making up their own rules. Then in the middle, you have semi-structured play. And this is what we think for the casual gaming space is sort of the sweet spot, right? This is the space where, you know, you've got, we call it, it's scaffolded play, where you've got some rules, you've got some structure around it, but there's actually a lot that the player themselves brings to the experience, right? Now, most gaming right now is a little bit more on the structured end, but where we're seeing the trends moving, and we're seeing people across the board being really interested, and we're seeing sort of this idea of, you know, 21st century skills, is moving a little bit further to the right on this thing, right? Moving a little away from the structure of what we call games and moving a little bit more towards the unstructuredness of play. And that's where we're seeing a lot of opportunity for the casual gaming space, both from an intuitiveness of the gameplay itself and people being able to pick it up really quickly and saying, oh, if you ever watched a young child with an iPad, right, there's something about obviously the interface, so you've taken away a lot of the interface issues, but it's also, you can see when there's a game or an activity or a play something that they intuitively get and they love it, right? Whereas when you have anything that you have to explain rules or the way it's done, then it tends to be a little more problematic for them if they can't experiment with it. So there's four main types of play that we've sort of, as we've been doing a lot of research globally, that we tend to see, right? We see construction, and we have pictures of sort of the non-digital versions of these. So this is, you know, sort of the idea of Lego or putting puzzles together. Imagination, which is everything from storytelling, dressing up, doll play, reading stories, you know, themselves. Movement, right? Playing balls, playing on a seesaw, or creativity, which could be, you know, music, art, drawing. Draw something, for you guys who are familiar with that, is a great example of that. Right now, what happens is there's quite a bit of, there are games that sort of might use a little bit of these main play patterns as sort of a tool within the game. But what I want to start thinking a little bit more as we're moving along this continuum towards play is, how do we base more play on these play patterns? And again, these are, I mean, I've got pictures of kid stuff here, but these are patterns that kids and adults across ages sort of inherently are drawn to, right? Creating things, using their imagination, creating, moving. What's interesting about adults is they often won't recognize it, right? And they sort of get out of the habit of play, but the second they get back into it, you literally can see, I mean, from neuroscience perspective, you can see those like parts of their brain light up again, right? And it just becomes this thing, oh yeah, this is what I was meant to do, right? And if you're talking about casual gaming and why we use casual games, which is things like stress release, right? You know, creativity at the end of a long day, on the commute, using these play patterns as more of a fundamental part of whatever the play is a way to sort of get people into that flow state quicker, right? So we look across platforms. This is a nice chart, I think, from some folks over at Frog Design, which sort of looks at, it's going to be a little hard to see. Basically, the top is sort of digital play, the bottom is physical play, then you have open versus closed play. And so what they've done is they've sort of mapped what physical, you know, physical and digital play and open versus closed play is. And you've got things like, over in digital Scratch from MIT. You've got, in physical and closed over here, sort of toys and things like that. What I want to talk about is that gaming, right, and I mentioned this earlier, does not necessarily equal play, right? So gaming is extrinsically motivated. Gaming is, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a difference, right? So a game is something where you have reward structures built in, whatever that happens to look like, and it pulls on extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is incredibly important, right? If we look at learning, or if we look at bringing information to people, that idea that you extrinsically motivate me gets me there initially. But for long-term, whether it's learning or long-term play, keeping somebody engaged, it really has to be an intrinsic motivation issue, right? This is why I have the sort of badgification of everything. I don't know if you guys are seeing that as much over here. We certainly have seen that a lot in the US, where people are saying, oh, you need to motivate people? Just put badges. Yeah, badges are great. And what we're sort of saying is, the reality is, badges don't really work. And I'm sure some of you guys have seen this, some of you especially who've tried it. It's like, well, why do you have a badge system? What's the whole point? That said, play, intrinsically motivated. Play is something I want to do. So when you focus more on the play aspects, and again, those sort of fundamental play patterns, you're creating intrinsic motivation for people to sort of want to engage with what you're doing. It doesn't mean that, again, it's not gaming. It just means that it's what's that sort of fundamental intrinsically motivated thing? Why am I doing it, right? I don't necessarily need to have badges. That may be great, and particularly for some kinds of players who are much more the achievement-oriented, right? Those would be great. But if you're trying to create more universal games, focusing on those intrinsic motivations is going to be more important. And certainly, we have seen this, gamification, right? This idea of gamification does not always mean an increase in engagement in learning. Just because I was talking about badges as sort of a catch-all, but just because you put reward structures on something, right? And I know there's a huge trend towards gamification, which of course is tied sort of very closely with what we talk about when we talk about casual gaming. It doesn't mean that you're increasing engagement. It doesn't necessarily mean if your goal is learning that you're increasing learning. So I think that, playification, maybe. I haven't coined that. Maybe I just coined that here. Can I trademark that right now? Right? Playification is a little more important. If we look right now, and these are just some examples, these are not meant to be representative, but I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the current digital play continuum that we were talking about. So you have your more traditional gameplay, your Mario, Angry Birds that are a little bit more structured. There's rules to them, although of course Angry Birds moves more towards semi-structured play because there's a lot of openness to it. We've seen, and most of these are focused sort of, again, on the kids space, but we've started to see a couple of really interesting and incredibly financially successful games in the more open-ended play market. Those are things like, and again, this is not just kids. These are, often we're seeing these games being picked up and the kids play it, and then the adults steal their iPad because they really want to be playing the game, right? Which to me is always a really good sign. If you buy it for your kid and either the older sibling or the parent is kind of addicted to it, then it's usually a good sign. You have things like Tokaboka. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. Really open-ended things. If you haven't seen it, check out Tokaboka Tea Party is one of their things. Totally open-ended play. You create a tea party. You put it out, you can eat each other's, drink each other's stuff, you can play with, your stuffed animals. It's a play pattern that we know kids like, right? This idea of creating and setting up and constructing my own little world and then, actually eating it. Very important. But that's a great example. Toontastic, which is a group out of San Francisco who have created basically a platform for storytelling. And I highly recommend that you go online and you just search Toontastic videos. You can see the videos that the kids have created, right? It's just sort of a very simple storytelling platform. Some of the funniest stuff I have ever seen, right? I mean, like kids talking about dragons and princesses and knights, but somehow there's a pickle involved. I mean, it's just, they just go so kind of crazy. But again, it's very addictive. They keep playing. Make Go, it's a little bit hard to see, but there you can see there's sort of a car type thing. This is really interesting. There's this interesting move between, I think in fact they're talking a little bit about it in the room next door, between the idea of the maker community or the physical making, right, and digital play. So Make Go is a great example of, it's an iPhone app or an iPod app that it creates different kinds of vehicles. But in order to make the vehicles go, you actually have to create the casing for it. You can make it with Legos. You can make, I think this one is sort of part Legos, or part wheels, part cardboard. But you create the physical item from scratch. It's very open-ended constructive play. And then the digital piece of it gives you sort of the engine to go with it. And then, something like UDraw, which wasn't as financially successful, but, sort of as a good example of creating devices that tie into game consoles that open up play a little bit. Draw Something's probably a little bit of a better example of that. So when we talk about building play for tomorrow, here are the things that I want to leave you with, just sort of some thought starters. The first is, I think we need to, as I've clearly been saying, rethink the fundamentals of how we're developing casual play, right? It's not just about creating a super fun game. How can we tap more into those intuitive, intrinsically motivating play patterns that we're seeing across the ages to create things that people really want to play all the time, right? But also have really positive benefits, stress reduction, learning, et cetera. The second is that we need to reframe this idea for people who do a lot of work in learning, again, across ages. We see that people often will create learning games, right? Whether it's for senior citizens or it's for children, they'll say, oh, learning games, that's a separate category, right? The reality is you learn from every game you play. So I think we need to rethink the fact that learning subsumes all these types of play. How can we make it a part of it or make it something that's a positive benefit from what we do, not necessarily a separate category, right? It also helps sales, by the way. Parents love education. Adults, senior citizens, it's how those brain games have done really well. Learning is value add. So if you're looking at from a pricing perspective, you add learning into it and message that, you can increase your price, which is always important. And the last thing is I think we need to do a little bit more refocusing. I talked about this earlier. We're still relatively focused on this more structured type of play in our gaming, and I think we need to move a little bit more towards unstructured. And this does not, for the record, mean a complete free-for-all, right? That obviously wouldn't necessarily work. But if you're talking about adding replayability into your games, creating some set of structured, more unstructured play within it adds replayability, right? If you're talking about just wanting to create, again, more intuitive games or casual play that people want to engage with, we sort of have to move a little bit further to the left of the spectrum. And most importantly, I know I've said this several times today, keeping in mind that play is not only for kids, right? I think that's one of the biggest issues is people often talk about play and they talk about kids and they talk about gaming and they talk about adults and kids. And the reality is adults need play just as much as kids do, if not more. It has incredibly important beneficial benefits, positive benefits to adults. And I think that as an industry, we need to be thinking about that, right? It's always great to make a lot of money, but it's even better if you're doing good along with it. And creating play and opportunities for adults to sort of step away and deal with their stress in a very positive way is something we should keep in mind. Thank you.